Let's continue reflecting on the contribution that the Arch, in fact, had on those who worked with him. And let's speak to someone who is in the board of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Intellectual Property Trust, Dr. Barney Pityana. Dr. Pityana, good evening to you, and thank you so much for your time this evening. When one listens to some of the residents in Vilakazi Street talk about, the late Archbishop, it's a story of hope, it's a story of humility, a story of strength, resilience, and at the same time, a story of truth. Talk to us about how you are reflecting on the life of the Archbishop tonight.
Archbishop Desmond Tutu is somebody who has been around almost for my entire life. In time, he was probably a less known figure than he is today, but made a deep impression on us university students at Forte in 1968. And he came to join the FEDSAM in 1967. And over the years, he's become gradually a more globally famous person, but he never lost his common touch. He became a global figure with his feet firmly on the ground in South Africa proper, in the townships where the suffering was taking place, and in the church that he was so fond of and was so committed to. So that's the Archbishop Tutu that I know.
And Dr. Pityana, you talk about someone that you say you've known very closely. I wonder, because for those who, have been in contact with him, and someone like a resident that spoke to our colleague this afternoon, talking about how he would bring food to, her mother and take care of those people on the ground. And you also talk about him being firmly on the ground. I wonder, for you personally, what are some of the memories that are not in the public domain that you have of you and the Arch?
The most memorable thing for us as Anglican students at Forte in 1967, and Forte at that time was under banned education, and there was no freedom, and we were angry young activists at the university at that time. We always knew Mrs. Leah, Mama Leah Tutu, and Archbishop Tutu had a home for us at any time. So it was a place of refuge, a sanctuary for us. And we got to know them in that way. During that time, I remember traveling with him through the length and breadth of this country when we were going to the conferences of the Anglican Students Federation. And he was always very, very humble. Somebody that would drive students to the conference and make us feel at home in his company. And then, of course, I left and went to exile in 1978. And by that time, he had left Forte. He had he'd been to Lesotho, he'd been to the World Council of Churches, and he'd become Dean of Johannesburg, and he had become Bishop of Lesotho. So throughout that time when our paths were not crossing, he always kept in touch with us. I wasn't the only one. Other of that generation of students that he was responsible for at Forte, he kept in touch with all of us until we came back, those of us who were in exile, and our careers, whatever our careers were, it took a very deep interest in our careers.
And when you then look at all this work that he's done for...
Are you with me?
I'm here, but Pityana, can you still hear me? Dr. Pityana, can you still hear us?
And I'm saying that as a... Yes, I'm here, I'm with you.
All right, okay.
But
Pardon me, I think we just had a bit of a break in transmission, but one of the things I wanted to ask you was, looking at the work that he's done for the country and the contribution that he then, made, and that you say that, at first he may not have been known, but right now celebrated globally. One of the things that was quite obvious and was never hidden, because he always wore his heart on his sleeve, is that he was not happy with how the state of politics was also turning out in South Africa.
I think, if I may hazard a guess, the earliest that most people in South Africa at large would have taken notice of him was when he wrote an open letter to Prime Minister, I think B.J. Vorster was the Prime Minister at that time, in 1976 when he became Dean of Johannesburg. He was warning Vorster about the seething, incoming anger of young people in Soweto. This was months before the Soweto uprising actually happened. And indeed, rather prophetically, within months of that letter, which was actually poo-pooed by Vorster and the National Party, in fact, it happened. Young people were angry, young people were killed, young people were put in jail, young people were hurt and injured. In Soweto, schools were closed. So much of what he said, and that was, I think, the first time many people took notice of him. As I say, some of us knew him because we were his students at university only a few years before. But in 1976, when he became Dean of Johannesburg, I think even in the Anglican Church, not many people actually knew who he was, because he'd been at the World Council of Churches based in London. And he was not elected Bishop of Johannesburg, for example, because people didn't quite understand who he was. But for me, that was a defining character of Archbishop Tutu. But I can say something else. What drew me to him rather very, very closely is that in 1968, as students at Fort Hare, we were on strike. And suddenly on a Friday, I think the 18th of August, we were surrounded by police with dogs and armed police, and isolating us from the rest of the staff and everybody was there. It was then Father Desmond Tutu and the Reverend Simon Kubule who braved the might of the police and broke the police cordon and demanded that they take a common cause with us as students. And the emotional effect of that on many of us those days.
And pardon me, sorry, Dr. Pityana, we're almost out of time, but one of the things, as I listen to you talk about this, a number of people have really spoken about how he stood for the students and made sure that at the time he really fights for their cause, as you have just described right now. But then you fast forward to recent years, it's almost ironic that for the system that he fought for, he was also not happy with how the governing party was also doing certain things in recent years.
I think the greatest insult to Archbishop Tutu was when the ANC removed his name from the program at Madiba's funeral, which is something that the president at the time would have known. It would never have been Madiba's wish. But he was removed at the last minute. He was then asked by the current president, Cyril Ramaphosa, to allow him to bless the crowds at the time. He did an amazingly stunning thing in really focusing the people who were there on the purpose for that event. And something that I think no one else could have done. Now, that was somebody who had been refused. He was not even invited to be there by the ANC government at that time. And he went there as a result of the intervention by Trevor Manuel and people like that. And he went there, but he was not in the program. And at the last minute, he was asked to say the final prayer. So yes, that was clearly very, very insulting. But being the person who he is, he wasn't going to hold grudges. He was not going to, he's never written or said anything about that. But that was something that had passed. He served his duty because at the end of the day, he was serving his country.
All right. Thank you so much for those reflections. I'm sure we are going to still be talking, Dr. Pityana, as the week progresses.